Look at this aerial photograph from December 1st, 2013. A Metro North passenger train lies twisted and broken along the banks of the Harlem River in the Bronx, New York. 7 passenger cars and a locomotive have derailed at a sharp curve, some cars resting on their sides, others at impossible angles. Emergency vehicles crowd the scene below. At 7:19 a.m., 115 passengers were riding this train toward Grand Central Terminal. Most were barely awake, still groggy from the early Sunday morning after Thanksgiving weekend. Some were reading. Others dozed. A few stared out the windows at the Hudson River passing by. The train was running smoothly, only a minute behind schedule, traveling along tracks the engineer had navigated thousands of times over his 15-year career. And then, without warning, the train entered a 30 miles per hour curve at 82 miles per hour, nearly 3 times the speed limit. The lead engineer, William Rockefeller, would later describe being in a daze, a trance-like state of highway hypnosis where his conscious mind disconnected from his actions. He was staring straight ahead, mesmerized, while his train hurtled toward a curve that would kill 4 people and injure 61 more in a derailment that lasted only seconds but would reverberate for years. This was Metro North's first passenger fatality in 30 years of operation. It was the deadliest train accident in New York City since 1991, and investigators would later conclude that it was entirely preventable. A federally mandated safety system called positive train control would have automatically slowed the train before it reached the curve. But that system hadn't been installed yet. Metro North, like many American railroads, had successfully lobbied for extensions to the deadline, arguing the technology was too expensive, too complex, unproven for commuter rail networks of their size. 4 people died because an experienced engineer went into a daze, and no automated system existed to stop a train traveling at triple the safe speed. This is the story of how sleep apnea, shift changes, corporate resistance to safety technology, and a deficient safety culture combined to create the costliest and deadliest accident in Metro North's history. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. We love seeing our global audience and how this story reaches people around the world. On the morning of December 1st, 2013, a Metro North Railroad Hudson Line passenger train derailed near the Spuyten Duyvil station in the Bronx. 4 of the 115 passengers were killed and another 61 injured. The accident caused $9 million in immediate damage, with an additional $60 million paid out in legal claims, making it the costliest accident in Metro North's history. William Rockefeller was operating the train that morning. He was a 15-year Metro North veteran, well respected among his colleagues. He hadn't started as an engineer, he'd begun as a clerk in the station master's office at Grand Central Terminal, working his way up through the ranks before spending a decade as an engineer. Other employees praised his smooth train handling. He was known as careful, competent, professional. On the morning of December 1st, nothing about his behavior suggested anything was wrong. But 2 weeks earlier, Rockefeller had made a change he later told investigators he'd been reluctant to make. He'd switched from afternoon shifts to morning shifts. The change might seem minor to outsiders, but for someone whose body had adapted to one sleep schedule, inverting it completely is brutal. Rockefeller lived in Germantown, approximately 27 miles north of Poughkeepsie. To make the morning shift, he had to leave his house at 3:30 a.m. That meant going to bed early the night before, around 8:30 p.m., to get adequate rest. On November 30th, the night before the accident, Rockefeller had worked a 9-hour shift and gone to bed at 8:30 p.m., as planned. He woke at 3:30 a.m., drove 43 minutes to work, and arrived on time. He bought a cup of coffee and a hard roll, filled out paperwork, attended the standard safety briefing, and conducted tests of the train's safety equipment. Co-workers who saw him that morning would later tell investigators he appeared alert and vivacious. Nothing seemed off. Nothing suggested the disaster that was coming. The train departing Poughkeepsie at 5:54 a.m. was the second southbound Hudson Line train of the day. It consisted of 7 Bombardier-made Shoreliner passenger coaches, 2 of which were closed off and used only for deadheading by employees, and a GEP-32 ACDM locomotive positioned at the rear. Metro North uses push-pull configuration, where the locomotive stays at the back and engineers operate from a cab car at the front. This design minimizes noise on the underground platforms at Grand Central Terminal, the train's final destination. The train carried approximately 115 passengers that morning, a light load typical for the early Sunday after Thanksgiving weekend. Michael Herman, the conductor, was another veteran employee. His assistant conductor was Maria Herbert, with whom he regularly worked. After the train picked up a third crew member, Chris Kelly, at Croton Harmon, they positioned themselves according to Metro North's operating procedures. Herbert would join Rockefeller in the cab to call out signals after the last stop. Herman would remain in the rear with other Metro North employees, doing paperwork and preparing for the next trip. The train left Poughkeepsie in pre-dawn darkness that gradually lightened to civil twilight. It traveled south along the Hudson Line, a route that hugs the Hudson River for much of its length, offering passengers views of the water when daylight permits. The train made all 6 scheduled stops in the upper, non-electrified portion of the line without incident. After Croton Harmon, it continued to Ossining, where it became an express. It made its last scheduled stop at Tarrytown just after dawn, running only about a minute behind schedule. From Tarrytown, the train continued south for 14 miles along a relatively straight section of track next to the river. It passed through 4 stations in Yonkers, navigating permanent and temporary speed restrictions without issue. South of Yonkers, the train entered the Bronx. The route continued straight and familiar, tracks Rockefeller had traveled thousands of times, landmarks he could probably navigate in his sleep. And that, investigators would later conclude, was part of the problem. The route was too familiar, too routine, too monotonous. In the pre-dawn darkness, with minimal traffic and a light passenger load, there was little to hold Rockefeller's attention. The train ran smoothly, the controls responded predictably. Stop after stop passed without incident. The rhythm of the journey became hypnotic, the steady sound of wheels on rails, the gentle swaying of the cab, the unchanging view of the river in the growing light. Rockefeller would later struggle to describe what happened in his mind during those minutes. He used words like dazed and mesmerized. He compared it to staring at taillights while driving on a highway for a long time, getting that hypnotic feeling where your eyes stay open and focused, but your conscious mind disconnects. He was looking straight ahead, seeing the tracks, but not really processing what he was seeing. His body was going through the familiar motions while his brain drifted somewhere else. This phenomenon is well documented in transportation safety research. It's called highway hypnosis, or sometimes white line fever when it affects truck drivers. It's a trance-like state that occurs during monotonous operating conditions, particularly when someone is tired, when the environment is unchanging, when the task has become so routine that it requires minimal conscious attention. The conscious mind disengages while the subconscious handles the repetitive tasks. It's dangerous precisely because the person doesn't realize it's happening. They're not asleep, their eyes are open, they appear to be paying attention, but their awareness has drifted away from the immediate environment. Truck drivers experience it on long overnight hauls. Pilots have reported it during extended flights on autopilot. And train engineers, traveling along straight, familiar routes in the early morning or late night, are particularly vulnerable. The phenomenon is made worse by fatigue, by shift changes that disrupt normal sleep patterns, by the absence of stimulation or variation in the environment. Rockefeller had been operating the train for nearly 2 hours by the time he approached the Bronx. Most of that time had been in darkness or twilight. Most of it had been along straight track beside the river. He'd made the scheduled stops, checked the signals, operated the controls, all routine actions he'd performed thousands of times. And somewhere along the way, without realizing it, his conscious attention had drifted into that dangerous zone of highway hypnosis. About 1.5 miles south of the Riverdale station, Rockefeller should have begun slowing the train. Just ahead was the curve at Spuyten Duyvil, a sharp bend in the tracks immediately before the station, located below the Henry Hudson Bridge where the Harlem River Ship Canal meets the Hudson. The curve requires trains to slow to 30 miles per hour. It's well marked, well known to every engineer who operates on the Hudson Line. It represents one of the most significant speed reductions on the entire route. But Rockefeller didn't slow down. The train continued at full speed, approximately 82 miles per hour. In the passenger cars, Linda Smith of Newburgh was barely awake. She'd boarded at Beacon with her sister Donna to attend a choral performance at Lincoln Center. But something pulled at her attention. The ride felt wrong. It was bumpy and just seemed really fast, she would later recall. The train was moving faster than it should. The motion felt aggressive, rougher than normal. In the cab, something finally broke through Rockefeller's trance. He felt that something wasn't right with the train. The realization hit him suddenly, and with terrible clarity, he was approaching the Spuyten Duyvil curve at full speed. He wasn't slowing down. The train was still traveling at 82 miles per hour, heading into a 30 miles per hour curve. Rockefeller's hands moved immediately to the brake controls. He initiated an emergency brake application, pulling the handle that would apply maximum braking force across all 7 cars. The brakes engaged, wheels locked, metal screeched against metal as the system fought to slow 400 tons of moving train. But it was already too late. The distance from where Rockefeller applied the brakes to where the curve began was too short. The speed was too high. The physics were unforgiving. The train entered the curve at 82 miles per hour. For a few seconds the wheels stayed on the rails, friction and centrifugal force balanced in a precarious equation. And then the balance broke. The outer wheels lifted off the rail. The train began to tilt. Once that process started, it accelerated with terrible inevitability, the train's own momentum and weight working against it, pulling it farther off the tracks with each fraction of a second. At 7:19 a.m., approximately 100 yards north of Spuyten Duyvil station and 11.4 miles north of Grand Central Terminal, the train derailed. In her passenger car, Linda Smith recalled the train turning sideways. The bumps she'd felt gave way to violent bounces, seat cushions flew through the air. It was like a movie going on around me. She would later describe, metal screeched, glass shattered. The world became chaos, debris entered the cars through broken windows. Joel Zaritsky, a dentist from LaGrangeville, headed to a convention, compared it to severe turbulence on an aeroplane, that stomach-dropping sensation of losing control, of physics taking over. In the rear deadhead car, conductor Michael Herman first heard a little bit of metallic rattling. It wasn't unusual by itself, trains make all sorts of sounds, but this one sounded odd. Then everything accelerated into violence. The next thing I know, he told investigators, my car had kicked, and I was thrown from the 4th seat across the coach up to the ceiling. I dropped down. I went back up again, and I slammed into the ceiling, and then I slammed down into the floor. He was a ragdoll, his body subject to forces beyond comprehension, smashing into surfaces that should have been stationary, but were now spinning and tumbling. In the front of the train, Maria Herbert was sitting in the passenger seat behind the cab when the derailment began. I looked up just to do what I was doing, and a split second later, I'm tumbling on the floor. I think I hit the ceiling several times. I didn't even have time to react or think. The violence was instant and overwhelming. One moment she was sitting normally, the next she was airborne, smashing into surfaces, her brain unable to process what was happening fast enough to protect herself. All 7 passenger cars and the locomotive left the tracks in a cascading failure that happened in seconds, but seemed to stretch forever for those inside. The rear cars remained relatively upright and came to rest next to the tracks, but the front cars experienced far more violent motion. They tilted, rolled, came to rest at impossible angles. The lead cab car, where Rockefeller and Herbert were located, ended up just short of the Harlem River, tilted severely with its front end nearly touching the water. When the train finally came to rest, an eerie silence fell, that strange quiet that follows catastrophic violence, where the absence of motion feels almost as shocking as the chaos that preceded it. Then the sounds began, groaning metal settling, hissing air from broken brake lines, broken glass tinkling to the ground. And worst of all, the cries of injured passengers trapped in the wreckage, calling for help that couldn't reach them yet. Michael Herman, despite suffering a head injury and bruises from his violent journey through the rear car, immediately took charge. He reported the derailment to the dispatcher, establishing critical communication that would bring emergency services. He worked with Chris Kelly to coordinate passengers and prepare for emergency responders. In the front, William Rockefeller, largely uninjured, protected perhaps by the cab's reinforced structure and his position at the controls, freed Maria Herbert from the pile of seat cushions that had buried her. She was conscious but had suffered a head injury. Seeing that Herman and Kelly had the overall situation in hand, Rockefeller remained with Herbert, providing what comfort he could, until help arrived. Linda Smith was trapped. The derailment had buried her under seat cushions and debris, leaving her unable to move. Her sister Donna, with whom she'd been traveling to the Lincoln Center performance, had been thrown from the train entirely. Donna was one of 4 people killed in the accident. Linda would be pulled from the wreckage injured but alive, having survived an experience that killed her sister just feet away. The other fatalities were James Lovell of Cold Spring, James Ferrari of Montrose, and Kisuk Ahn of Queens. They had been ordinary commuters on an ordinary Sunday morning train, heading into Manhattan for work or leisure. Now they were gone, victims of a derailment that happened in seconds. The New York City Fire Department responded with overwhelming force, 125 firefighters rushed to the scene, but their ability to immediately access all victims was hampered by a critical danger. The third rails that powered electric trains on this section were still energized, carrying 750 volts of deadly electricity. EMS workers had to wait for Con Edison crews to arrive and de-energize the rails before they could safely access some areas of the wreckage. Every minute of delay was agonizing for rescuers who could hear injured passengers calling for help but couldn't reach them without risking electrocution. As emergency responders worked to extract victims, the scale became clear: 4 dead, 61 injured, many seriously. All service on the Hudson Line was immediately suspended. Metro North, one of the nation's busiest commuter railroads serving hundreds of thousands daily, had just experienced its first passenger fatality in 30 years of operation. The nearby Amtrak West Side Line was reopened by 3 p.m., but the Hudson Line would remain closed for days. Survivors were taken to a family resource center at nearby John F. Kennedy High School. Emergency personnel worked to account for all passengers, checking ticket records to ensure no one was still trapped or had wandered away in shock. By afternoon, once all passengers were confirmed accounted for, the center closed. For the 26,000 commuters who relied on the Hudson Line daily, the accident created immediate disruption. Monday would be the first regular business day back from Thanksgiving. Metro North suspended all service south of Croton-Harmon and restored limited service only to Yonkers, 3 stations north of the derailment. Shuttle buses provided service to subway connections. Additional shuttles ran between Tarrytown and White Plains. Westchester County offered free parking at Valhalla Station. Across the Hudson in Rockland County, officials added extra express bus service across the Tappan Zee Bridge. Traffic on the Sawmill River Parkway increased as drivers sought alternatives. Metro North crews worked around the clock to remove derailed cars and repair damage. They spent the day after the crash replacing ballast and laying new concrete ties. By the evening of December 2nd, all cars had been righted and restored to tracks. They were taken to Metro North yards at Croton-Harmon and Highbridge, where the National Transportation Safety Board impounded them for investigation. Crews siphoned 900 gallons of diesel fuel from the locomotive before removal, then cleaned spilled fuel with specialized equipment. Limited service on one track was restored by Wednesday morning, December 4th. Commuters waiting at Poughkeepsie for the first train to run the same route at the same time expressed surprise that Metro North cleared the line so quickly. Some even expressed sympathy for Rockefeller. While they had no fears of recurrence, one woman was surprised there had been no fail-safe systems. "I really thought they had that in place. This is the United States." That comment would prove prophetic. The technology she assumed existed, positive train control, had been mandated by federal law but not yet implemented. A team from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived at the scene within hours of the derailment. This is standard procedure for any major transportation accident. NTSB investigators are dispatched immediately to preserve evidence, interview witnesses while memories are fresh, and begin the painstaking process of reconstructing exactly what happened and why. The Spuyten Duyvil derailment would become one of the most scrutinized accidents in Metro North's history, not just because of the fatalities, but because of what it revealed about systemic failures in railroad safety culture. The NTSB's initial examination of the wreckage found that the train's brakes had been deployed seconds prior to the crash. This was immediately significant. It meant Rockefeller had attempted to stop. He hadn't been completely unaware. Something had broken through his trance in time for him to realize the danger and react. But the reaction had come too late. The tracks themselves showed no problems, no defects, no broken rails, nothing that would have caused the derailment independent of excessive speed. The critical evidence came from the train's event recorders, devices similar to the black boxes on aircraft that continuously record speed, brake applications, throttle position, and other operational data. When investigators downloaded and analyzed the data, the numbers were shocking. The train had been traveling at 82 miles per hour when it entered the curve. The speed limit for that section of track was 30 miles per hour. Rockefeller had attempted to brake, but the emergency brake application had reached its maximum level only 5 seconds after the train entered the curve, far too late to prevent the derailment. 82 miles per hour, in a 30 miles per hour zone. That's not a minor speeding violation. That's not slightly exceeding the limit by a few miles per hour, due to inattention. That's traveling at nearly 3 times the safe speed for the curve. At that speed, derailment wasn't a possibility, it was a certainty. The laws of physics are unforgiving. A train cannot navigate a curve designed for 30 miles per hour while traveling at 82 miles per hour. The centrifugal force simply overwhelms the rail's ability to hold the wheels on track. Early media reports, based on fragmentary information and speculation, suggested that Rockefeller had claimed the brakes failed. Rail safety experts immediately pointed out that this was extremely unlikely. Train brakes are equipped with fail-safe devices that automatically activate if they detect a pressure drop in the system. If anything goes wrong with the brake system, a leak, a rupture, a mechanical failure, the default is for the brakes to engage, not disengage. This design principle, standard across the rail industry, means that brake failure of the type that would prevent stopping is vanishingly rare. The NTSB quickly confirmed there was no problem with the brakes or the tracks. The signals were functioning properly. The speed limit signs were clearly posted, the curve was well marked, there was nothing mechanically or infrastructurally wrong. This was not a failure of equipment or maintenance. This was a human factors failure. Investigators immediately began assembling a timeline of Rockefeller's activities in the 72 hours preceding the accident. They needed to understand his physical and mental state. Had he been drinking, using drugs? Was he ill? Was there something in his personal life that might have distracted him? They conducted blood and urine tests, checking for alcohol, illegal drugs, and prescription medications that might impair judgment or reaction time. The results came back negative for alcohol, negative for illegal drugs. Rockefeller's cell phone records showed no usage at the time of the accident. He hadn't been texting or making calls. Every objective test that might have explained impairment came back clean. But when investigators were finally able to interview Rockefeller in detail, he provided an explanation that was both simple and deeply troubling. He admitted that he had drifted into a daze in the minutes before the accident. He used words like mesmerized and hypnotized. He compared it to staring at taillights on a highway during a long drive. He said he was looking straight ahead, but wasn't really processing what he was seeing. His conscious mind had disconnected from the immediate task of operating the train. He described it as an almost trance-like state that he snapped out of only when he felt something wasn't right, and by then it was too late. This admission was remarkable for its honesty. Rockefeller could have claimed he didn't remember, or insisted the brakes failed, or invented some other explanation that might have deflected blame. Instead, he told investigators the truth. He had experienced a lapse of attention so severe that he entered a dangerous curve at triple the safe speed without realizing it until it was too late to prevent disaster. 2 days after the accident, Anthony Bottalico, head of the Association of Commuter Railroad Employees, the union representing Metro-North workers, including Rockefeller, made a statement to the media. He said that Rockefeller had nodded off before the accident. He compared it to white line fever experienced by truck drivers on long hauls. He noted that Rockefeller had recently switched from afternoon shifts to morning shifts, which required a complete inversion of his sleep schedule. The statement was intended to provide context, to explain how an experienced, competent engineer could have made such a catastrophic error. But the statement violated NTSB protocols. During active investigations, parties to the investigation, which includes unions, railroads, equipment manufacturers, and other stakeholders, are required to keep information confidential and avoid public speculation about causes. Bottalico's public comments about Rockefeller nodding off went beyond providing context and strayed into conclusions about the accident's cause. The NTSB responded swiftly and severely. They barred the union from further participation in the investigation. This was a significant penalty. Being party to an NTSB investigation means having access to evidence, being present during interviews, and having input into the investigative process. Losing that access meant the union could no longer directly represent Rockefeller's interests or the interests of its members during the investigation. The message was clear: violate confidentiality protocols and face exclusion from the process. Shortly after Bottalico's comments, Metro-North suspended William Rockefeller without pay. This is standard procedure following a serious accident while investigations are ongoing. But for Rockefeller, who had been with Metro-North for 15 years and had an unblemished safety record until that morning, the suspension marked the beginning of a professional and personal nightmare. He went from being a respected engineer to being the man responsible for Metro-North's first passenger fatalities in 30 years. His face was in newspapers and on television. His name became synonymous with the deadliest train accident in New York City in over 2 decades. In early April 2014, 4 months after the accident, federal investigators revealed a crucial finding. After the accident, Rockefeller had been diagnosed with severe obstructive sleep apnea. This is a medical condition where breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep. People with sleep apnea often don't realize they have it. They may think they're sleeping adequately, but the constant interruptions to breathing prevent them from reaching deep restorative sleep stages. The result is chronic fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and increased risk of attention lapses even when the person believes they're well rested. Sleep apnea is often associated with obesity, which creates excess tissue in the throat that can block airways during sleep. Rockefeller's weight had contributed to his condition, but he hadn't been diagnosed before the accident. He didn't know he had a medical condition that was preventing him from getting adequate rest despite going to bed at reasonable hours. When he told investigators he'd gone to bed at 8:30 p.m. the night before the accident and believed he'd gotten adequate sleep, he was telling the truth as he understood it. But his undiagnosed sleep apnea meant that even with 8 hours in bed, he wasn't getting the restorative sleep his body needed. This diagnosis raised immediate questions about Metro-North's screening procedures. Should the railroad have been testing engineers for sleep disorders? Should there have been medical evaluations that might have caught Rockefeller's condition before it contributed to a fatal accident? The NTSB would later conclude that Metro-North had failed to adequately screen employees in safety-critical positions for conditions like sleep apnea that could impair their ability to perform their duties safely. But there was another finding from Rockefeller's blood tests. Investigators found a small amount of chlorpheniramine in his system, an antihistamine commonly found in over-the-counter cold medications. Anyone who has taken cold medicine knows that many formulations cause drowsiness. The packaging on these medications typically includes warnings not to drive or operate heavy machinery while using them because of potential sedative effects. Operating a commuter train carrying over 100 passengers certainly qualifies as operating heavy machinery. When initially interviewed, Rockefeller had denied taking any medications. His lawyer later explained that Rockefeller might not have remembered taking an over-the-counter cold remedy, or might not have considered it significant enough to mention. But the presence of an antihistamine with known sedative effects, combined with undiagnosed sleep apnea and a recent shift change, painted a picture of an engineer whose ability to maintain attention was compromised by multiple factors, none of which he or Metro-North had adequately recognized or addressed. The district attorney's office announced they were considering criminal charges. This added another layer of stress to Rockefeller's situation. Not only had he lost his job and his professional reputation, not only was he living with the knowledge that his inattention had killed 4 people and injured 61 more, but he now faced the possibility of criminal prosecution. His lawyer argued that taking an over-the-counter cold medication shouldn't be grounds for criminal charges, especially when Rockefeller hadn't been aware of his sleep apnea condition and had believed himself adequately rested. While the investigation of Rockefeller's personal factors continued, attention also turned to a larger question: could technology have prevented this accident? The answer, according to virtually every safety expert who examined the accident, was yes. The technology was called Positive Train Control, or PTC, and it had been federally mandated but not yet implemented. Positive Train Control is an automated system that monitors train speed and location, and can automatically slow or stop a train if it exceeds speed limits or approaches dangerous situations. Using GPS, digital track maps, and wireless communications, PTC systems know where every train is at all times and what the speed limit is for each section of track. If a train exceeds the limit, the system first alerts the engineer. If the engineer doesn't respond by slowing down, the system takes control and automatically applies the brakes. In the case of the Spuyten Duyvil derailment, PTC would have detected that the train was approaching a curve with a 30 miles per hour speed limit while traveling at 82 miles per hour. It would have alerted Rockefeller, giving him an opportunity to brake himself. When he didn't respond, because he was in his trance-like daze, the system would have automatically applied the brakes with enough distance to slow the train to safe speed before entering the curve. The accident simply wouldn't have happened. 4 people would still be alive, 61 people wouldn't have been injured. Rockefeller's career and reputation would be intact. The technology wasn't theoretical or unproven. It existed. It worked. And after a deadly 2008 commuter train collision in Los Angeles that killed 25 people, the Federal Railroad Administration had mandated that all American railroads implement PTC by 2015, but railroads had resisted. They complained about the cost, estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars per railroad for implementation. They argued the technology was complex and unproven for large commuter rail networks. They lobbied Congress for deadline extensions. Metro-North and the Long Island Railroad, both operated by New York's Metropolitan Transportation Authority, were among the railroads seeking extensions. They had budgeted $600 million of the estimated $900 million cost for PTC installation, but they argued the technology was untested and unproven for commuter railroads of their size and complexity. After the Spuyten Duyvil crash, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo appeared on a radio talk show and conceded that PTC was controversial. Some people say it's not what it's cracked up to be. But rail safety experts were nearly unanimous. PTC would have prevented the Spuyten Duyvil derailment. The technology might be expensive and complex, but it worked. And while railroads debated costs and implementation timelines, people were dying in accidents that could have been prevented. Several days after the accident, the New York Times revealed an interesting detail. The train had been equipped with a device called an alerter. This system sounds an alarm when the train exceeds speed limits for 25 seconds and automatically shuts down the engine after an additional 15 seconds if the engineer takes no action. It was simpler than full PTC, but could have prevented the accident. However, there was a critical flaw in how Metro-North used the system. The alerter was installed in the locomotive at the rear of the train, not in the cab car where Rockefeller was actually operating from. This was a stunning oversight. Metro-North had safety technology that might have prevented the accident, but it was installed in the wrong place. The locomotive at the rear had the alerter system, but Rockefeller was operating from the front cab car, which was equipped only with a traditional dead man's switch, a device that requires constant pressure or periodic action to prevent automatic braking. The dead man's switch is designed to prevent a train from continuing if the engineer becomes incapacitated, but it doesn't monitor speed or prevent excessive speed on curves. Rail safety experts pointed out that the alerter system could easily be configured to force trains to slow at dangerous curves like Spuyten Duyvil. It relied on signals sent through the rails themselves, so the technology was simpler and more proven than full PTC. The MTA announced it was considering installing alerter systems in cabs at 30 locations on the Metro-North and LIR networks where significant speed reductions were required. On December 6, 5 days after the accident, the Federal Railroad Administration issued an emergency order. It required Metro-North to have 2 qualified crew members in the cab at any point where the speed limit drops by more than 20 mph until the railroad installed automated speed control technology. This was essentially a human backup system. If one crew member experienced a lapse of attention, the other would presumably notice and take action. The next day, Metro-North announced it was upgrading signals at the Spuyten Duyvil curve and several other locations in the system. They would also lower the speed limit approaching the curve so the drop would be less than 20 mph, which would eliminate the requirement for 2 crew members in the cab. This was a band-aid solution, addressing the specific circumstances of this accident without implementing comprehensive safety improvements. Senators Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut and Charles Schumer of New York called on Metro-North to install cameras to monitor both the tracks and the engineers. The idea was that video recordings could help investigate future accidents, and that knowing they were being monitored might help keep engineers focused. On December 12, the FRA went much further. They ordered Operation Deep Dive, a comprehensive safety review of Metro-North's entire operation. Every aspect of the railroad's corporate culture would be evaluated by a panel of rail safety experts. This was an extreme step. The FRA had used this level of scrutiny only once before since 2006, following a series of accidents involving CSX freight trains. For the agency to order Operation Deep Dive meant they believed Metro-North's problems went far beyond a single engineer's lapse of attention. The review examined everything: maintenance procedures, training programs, safety culture, management priorities, communication systems, record keeping, and the relationship between management and workers. Teams of experts interviewed employees at all levels, examined documents and procedures, observed operations, and analyzed accident data. In mid-March 2014, the FRA released its report to Congress. The conclusions were damning. Metro-North, the report stated, had a deficient safety culture. The FRA identified 3 overarching safety concerns that pervaded the organization. First, an overemphasis on on-time performance. Metro-North, like many transit agencies, was measured heavily on whether trains ran on schedule. Being on time was a key performance metric, something that affected management evaluations and public perception. But the report found that this emphasis on schedule adherence had created a culture where avoiding delays sometimes took priority over safety concerns. Employees felt pressure to keep trains moving even when safety considerations suggested slowing down or stopping to address potential problems. Second, an ineffective safety department and poor safety culture. The railroad safety organization was found to be understaffed, under-resourced, and lacking authority to enforce safety requirements effectively. Safety concerns raised by employees often weren't adequately addressed. Training on safety procedures was inconsistent. The overall culture treated safety as a compliance checkbox rather than a fundamental operational priority. Third, an ineffective training program. The FRA found that Metro-North's training for engineers, conductors, and other operational staff was inadequate. New employees weren't receiving comprehensive instruction. Continuing education for experienced employees was minimal. Critical safety procedures weren't being reinforced through regular training updates. The result was a workforce where knowledge of proper procedures was inconsistent and where dangerous practices could develop and spread without correction. The report directed Metro-North to submit a plan within 60 days for addressing these systemic issues. But the agency noted one encouraging sign. Many Metro-North employees had cooperated thoroughly and honestly with investigators, suggesting that while the management culture had problems, the workforce included many dedicated professionals who wanted to see improvements. The Spuyten Duyvil derailment was the first accident involving passenger fatalities in Metro-North's 30-year history. It was the deadliest train accident in New York City since a 1991 subway derailment in Manhattan. But it wasn't Metro-North's only recent accident. 2 days after the derailment, FRA Director Joseph Sabo sent a letter to MTA head Thomas Prendergast that was highly critical of the entire transit agency. Earlier in 2013, there had been a derailment on the New Haven line serving Connecticut and Westchester. There had been a CSX freight derailment on the Hudson line on the very next curve south of where the Spuyten Duyvil wreck occurred, literally the next curve beyond the station. There had been an accident on the New Haven line that killed a track worker. These incidents, combined with the Spuyten Duyvil derailment, totaled 5 deaths and 129 injuries in less than 7 months. The specific causes of each of these accidents may vary, Sabo wrote. But regardless of the reasons, 4 serious accidents in less than 7 months is simply unacceptable. He demanded a serious good faith commitment to the safe operation of the system and asked Metro-North to tell employees specifically what it would do to improve safety. He requested an answer in 2 days. Immediate corrective action is imperative. Metro-North responded quickly. The day after Sabo's letter, they announced a confidential telephone line where employees could report close calls, near-miss incidents that hadn't resulted in accidents but could have. This was an attempt to create a reporting culture where safety concerns could be raised without fear of retaliation. Prendergast later replied that the railroad had held mandatory safety discussions for 4,000 employees at 20 locations since the accident. In late 2014, almost a year after the accident, the National Transportation Safety Board released its final report. The conclusions were clear, detailed, and damning. After reiterating its earlier finding that positive train control would have prevented the accident entirely, the report identified the most direct cause: William Rockefeller's inattention as the train entered the curve. But the report went much deeper than simply blaming the engineer. The NTSB found multiple contributing factors that created the conditions for disaster. Rockefeller's undiagnosed severe obstructive sleep apnea had significantly hampered his ability to adjust to the morning shift he'd begun working just 2 weeks before the accident. Despite believing he'd gotten adequate rest, he'd gone to bed at 8:30 p.m. and slept for what should have been sufficient hours. His sleep apnea meant he wasn't achieving the deep restorative sleep his body needed. He was chronically fatigued without realizing it. His judgment and attention compromised by a medical condition he didn't know he had. The report also noted the presence of chlorpheniramine, the antihistamine found in his blood after the accident. While the amount was small, the medication's known sedative effects combined with his underlying sleep deprivation and the monotonous operating conditions created a perfect storm for the type of attention lapse he experienced. But the NTSB didn't stop with Rockefeller's individual circumstances. The report faulted Metro-North for not screening employees in safety-critical positions for sleep disorders. Operating a commuter train carrying over 100 passengers at speeds up to 80 miles per hour is undeniably safety-critical work. Yet Metro-North had no program to identify engineers who might be suffering from conditions like sleep apnea that could impair their ability to maintain attention during long, monotonous routes. The railroad conducted drug and alcohol testing, but medical screening for conditions that could affect job performance was minimal or non-existent. The report also faulted the Federal Railroad Administration for not requiring railroads to conduct such screening. The FRA set standards for many aspects of railroad operations: track maintenance, signal systems, equipment specifications, crew qualifications, but medical screening for conditions like sleep apnea wasn't mandated. The agency had left it to individual railroads to decide what medical evaluations were necessary, and Metro-North, like many railroads, had decided that beyond basic physical exams and substance testing, medical screening wasn't a priority. The NTSB made specific recommendations. Railroads should implement comprehensive medical screening programs for employees in safety-critical positions, with particular attention to sleep disorders. Engineers, conductors, and other operational staff should be evaluated for conditions that might impair alertness or judgment, and the FRA should make such screening mandatory across the industry rather than leaving it to individual railroads' discretion. The issue of positive train control dominated much of the post-accident discussion. After the 2008 collision in Los Angeles that killed 25 people, Congress had passed legislation mandating PTC implementation by 2015. But as that deadline approached, it became clear that most railroads weren't going to make it. The technology was more complex and expensive than initially anticipated. Railroads lobbied heavily for extensions, arguing they needed more time and that the technology was still being refined for commuter rail applications. Representative Sean Patrick Maloney, whose neighbor James Lovell had been one of those killed at Spuyten Duyvil, introduced legislation to make low-interest loans and guarantees available so commuter railroads could afford PTC implementation. Other Congress members from the lower Hudson Valley joined as co-sponsors. The message was clear: cost couldn't be an excuse for delay when the technology could prevent deaths, but the railroad industry's lobbying was effective. The original 2015 deadline was extended to 2018, then to the end of 2020. On December 23, 2020, 7 years after the Spuyten Duyvil derailment, the MTA finally completed its PTC implementation. All Metro-North and Long Island Railroad trains were now operating under positive train control. The system that would have automatically prevented Rockefeller from entering the curve at 82 miles per hour was finally in place. It had taken the deaths of 4 people, the injury of 61 more, and years of pressure from safety advocates and the families of victims. But the technology that everyone agreed could have prevented the accident was now operational. For William Rockefeller, the consequences were severe and permanent. After initially being suspended without pay, he was eventually terminated from Metro-North. The district attorney's office ultimately decided not to pursue criminal charges. While his inattention had caused the derailment, the presence of undiagnosed sleep apnea and the use of an over-the-counter medication that he hadn't realized would impair him created enough ambiguity about criminal intent that prosecution was deemed unlikely to succeed. But avoiding criminal charges didn't save his career or his reputation. Rockefeller, who had worked his way up from clerk to engineer over 15 years and had been respected by colleagues for his smooth train handling, was now unemployable in his profession. His name would forever be associated with Metro-North's deadliest accident. The psychological burden of knowing his lapse of attention had killed 4 people and injured 61 more would stay with him for life. The families of the 4 victims, Donna Smith, James Lovell, James Ferrari and Kissa Khan, received financial settlements as part of the $60 million in legal claims paid out by Metro-North and its insurers. But no amount of money could compensate for their losses. These were ordinary people who had boarded a train on a Sunday morning expecting a routine commute into Manhattan. They died because an engineer experienced a few minutes of inattention and because safety technology that could have prevented the accident hadn't been installed despite being federally mandated. The survivors too carried lasting impacts. Many of the 61 injured suffered serious trauma, broken bones, head injuries, psychological damage. Linda Smith, who survived while her sister died, would have to live with that survivor's guilt. Others who were trapped in the wreckage, who experienced the terror of the derailment and its aftermath, developed anxiety about train travel. The psychological scars of those few seconds of violence would last for years or lifetimes. Metro-North implemented the changes demanded by the 4A. They revised training programs, strengthened their safety department, worked to shift the organizational culture away from the overemphasis on on-time performance that the deep dive report had identified. They installed upgraded signaling at dangerous curves. They implemented medical screening for sleep disorders. They eventually completed PTC installation. But these changes came after the accident, not before. They were reactions to disaster rather than proactive prevention. The cost of the accident totaled far more than the $9 million in immediate damage and the $60 million in legal settlements. The damage to Metro-North's reputation, the loss of public trust, the psychological impact on employees who wondered if they could be the next to make a fatal mistake, these costs were incalculable. And the cost to the families who lost loved ones, to the survivors who were injured, to William Rockefeller whose career and life were destroyed, those costs couldn't be measured in dollars. This disaster was entirely preventable. Positive train control technology existed and had been federally mandated. If it had been installed as originally required, the accident simply wouldn't have happened. The system would have detected the excessive speed and automatically slowed the train before it reached the curve. 4 people would still be alive. 61 people wouldn't have been injured. Rockefeller's career would be intact. Metro-North's reputation wouldn't have been tarnished. But railroads had successfully lobbied for delays, arguing the technology was too expensive, too complex, unproven for their specific applications. They prioritized avoiding immediate costs over preventing future deaths. And the federal government, despite mandating the technology, granted extension after extension, allowing railroads to continue operating without the safety systems that experts agreed could prevent accidents. The pattern is depressingly familiar. A disaster occurs. Investigations identify the cause. Experts recommend solutions, but implementing those solutions requires spending money and changing established practices, so there's resistance. Industries lobby for delays. Costs are prioritized over safety. And then another accident happens, more people die, and the cycle repeats. William Rockefeller experienced a lapse of attention that lasted perhaps 2 or 3 minutes. In that brief window, his conscious mind disconnected from the task of operating the train. He entered a trance-like state of highway hypnosis, staring straight ahead but not really processing what he was seeing. When he finally snapped out of it and realized the danger, he had seconds to react. It wasn't enough. His brief lapse killed 4 people and injured 61 more. But his lapse didn't occur in isolation. It happened because he had undiagnosed sleep apnea that Metro-North didn't screen for. It happened because he'd recently changed shifts and his body hadn't fully adjusted. It happened because he'd taken an over-the-counter cold medication without realizing its sedative effects would compound his existing fatigue. It happened because he was operating on a monotonous route in low-light conditions that are known to contribute to attention lapses. And most importantly, it happened because the automated safety system that would have caught his mistake and prevented the accident, positive train control, hadn't been installed despite being federally mandated. On the morning of December 1, 2013, William Rockefeller, a 15-year Metro-North veteran known for his smooth train handling, went into a daze while operating a commuter train. He entered a 30 miles per hour curve at 82 miles per hour. 4 people died. The accident was entirely preventable. The technology to prevent it existed. It just hadn't been installed yet because railroads had successfully delayed implementation, prioritizing costs over safety. 7 years later, positive train control was finally operational on Metro-North. The system that could have saved 4 lives in 2013 was protecting passengers in 2020. But for Donna Smith, James Lovell, James Ferrari, and Kisuk Ahn, the protection came 7 years too late. That is the lesson of the Spuyten Duyvil derailment. Technology can prevent disasters, but only if we actually implement it, rather than allowing cost concerns and industry resistance to delay safety improvements until after people have died to prove they were necessary.